So I think we have to be a bit more cautious about these, inflammatory and sweeping trade actions, because for a lot of countries, the choice between the US and China may not be that hard.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Max Yoeli. He's a senior research fellow at Chatham House. He's spoken to us about Liberation Day, the day Donald Trump imposes all his tariffs on these 15 countries, the dirty 15, they're calling them, the countries that are taking more from the United States than the United States is getting from them. So we're going through basically what is a tariff in layman's terms. We're breaking it down for you. We're also speaking about which countries will be affected, which countries take most from the United States, who's going to kind of come up empty. So, and which countries have tried to broker a deal with the United States and so far have had a bit of bad luck. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Max Yoeli is Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Good to be with you.
Now, today, of course, is Liberation Day. As Donald Trump would put it, he's imposing further tariffs on any country that's exporting their goods into the United States, which of course falls on any company in America that is importing those goods and services. So anyone that relies on bringing those products into the United States. So can you kind of walk us through in layman's terms who and what will feel the brunt of this?
Sure, of course. So as you indicated, a tariff is a tax that applies on foreign goods imported into the issuing country, so in this case, the United States. And often they're applied as a way to make foreign products less attractive to support a domestic producer, for instance. Sometimes they're also applied as a way of punishing trading partners for unfair trading practices, whether that's subsidizing their domestic industries or dumping products at below what they are sold for in the domestic market or even below cost. Now, the administration has, I think, proffered many justifications for why it would want to pursue tariffs. There's the prospect of raising revenue to replace other domestic taxes. There's the prospect of rebalancing trade relationships, of using it as a coercive tool to achieve unrelated policy aims. And I think it's worth highlighting that, pursuing any one of these paths individually is quite difficult. Pursuing all of them together is contradictory or even impossible. In terms of who the brunt of the cost will fall on, I think ultimately being a tax that is paid by the U.S. importer of the good, the cost will fall largely on U.S. businesses and consumers. And studies from previous tariff rounds have shown that the costs of tariffs are passed largely on to consumers, even if it is a business that pays upfront the initial kind of import duty. So I think we can anticipate, some headwinds in the U.S. economy, whether that's challenges to growth, challenges to employment. We've already seen a significant amount of uncertainty as consumer and business confidence plummet, and the markets are clearly rattled, having already corrected and facing their worst quarters in the beginning of this year since 2022. So with more tariffs on the way, I think that uncertainty will continue to, sap U.S. economic growth and dynamism.
And there's been so many questions, Max, over who bears the brunt of these tariffs. A kind of false narrative is that the exporting country are the ones that cop all the money, all the tax. But yes, it does fall on the American consumer. So does this kind of contradict what Donald Trump pledged in his presidential campaign, which was all about putting more money into Americans' pockets?
I think it does. I think already we are seeing tariffs or the threat of tariffs contribute to prices remaining elevated in a way that will have a real cost for Americans. And notably, tariffs fall hardest on those who are least equipped to afford them, especially the way that they flow through to consumers in lower margin sectors, and kind of the amount that lower income Americans spend on goods proportionally compared to higher income Americans. These tariffs will hit those who are least well off the hardest. And when you look at the swing of lower income Americans from 2020 to 2024, how they went more strongly to the Trump camp than previously, it is almost an insult to his base in that way, or to some of the people who elected him, hoping that he would address first and foremost prices that they found intolerably high under the previous administration. Now, in terms of costs, I will say, the focus on this isn't purely domestic, and there's a reason why leaders around the world are very concerned about the impact of tariffs on their own economies. From Canada to Mexico to China, Europe, and around the world, leaders recognize that significant U.S. tariffs will be a challenge to their exporters, that it will, impose significant costs and threaten jobs and growth in their own economies. And I think looking at the tariffs that have been imposed already, we see headwinds in Mexico, Canada, in China, and then sectorally, the steel and aluminum tariffs that are coming online that are stronger than the ones that Trump imposed in 2018. Those pose a real consequences for a place like the United Kingdom, where not only are exporters directly affected by potentially losing a market or having fewer exports to that market, but they also face the prospect of more cheap goods coming into the UK market from around the world. So having more domestic competition. And then, in terms of the domestic impact of the United States, it may well protect certain industries. So for instance, the 2018 steel tariffs helped to protect about 1,000 steel jobs, add 1,000 steel jobs, but at the cost of another 75,000 manufacturing jobs in downstream industries. So when you look at the 12 million workers who work in industries that in some way rely on steel and aluminum inputs in the United States, there's a real concern about the employment effects in the manufacturing sectors, which is, again, counter to one of the pledges that Trump wrote into the White House.
Because Trump's kind of objective, what he says this is all about, he says he wants to bring back more domestic jobs, make domestic production more attractive. He says that these tariffs create more factory jobs, they shrink federal deficit, they lower food prices, and they allow the government to subsidize childcare. But what I worry about this, Max, is that these tariffs, because there are so many already implemented, I'll read out what's already implemented for the viewers. There's 25% tariffs on imported goods from Mexico and Canada, some imported goods, 20% tariffs on some imported goods from China, 25% tariffs on imported steel products, 10% tariffs on aluminium products, and 25% tariffs on all car manufacturing and car parts, along with Venezuelan oil. So my worry is so many tariffs at the same time, with the objective of trying to create more jobs, with the objective of trying to make more production within America and drive that attractiveness towards buying from American companies. Like, does the US have enough production, enough facilities in place to be able to take on all of the stuff that they've been outsourcing from foreign countries?
Look, I think tariffs, when used in a targeted strategic way, can be part of a broader economic toolkit to boost manufacturing, to protect domestic sectors. I think the list of tariffs that you just read off underscores that that is not the approach that this administration is taking. If you wanted to protect a particular sector or to boost U.S. competitiveness, you would, potentially use a targeted tariff in concert with other economic tools. You would invest hugely domestically, use the other tools of industrial policy to, make that part of a national agenda. But using tariffs in a frankly chaotic, untargeted, and blanket way is, I think, undermining that goal. And, the contradiction becomes clear when you look at a strategic industry like data centers and AI, or shipbuilding, for instance, where by raising the cost of key inputs, whether you're talking about, potentially tariffs on semiconductors, or even just, some of the steel-based electrical equipment that helps data centers run, or computer equipment, or the steel that goes into building ships. By making these more expensive, you make it harder for U.S. industry in those areas to thrive, and you're cutting into their competitiveness. So, does the U.S. have the capacity to start making all of these products at home? Maybe in some industries, maybe not in others. I think there's also the question of desirability. The United States may want to lead in certain next generation industries, but does it want to, replace its imports of low value add goods? Does it want to start making much more apparel and shoes, things that were outsourced long ago? I don't know. That's a strategic question maybe for the administration. I think, most Americans would have a strong view once they see kind of the consequences of that shift. But these decisions, these investment decisions to open a new factory, to shift supply chains, are extremely expensive, long-term decisions. And for businesses to try to make those decisions in an environment where policy is one thing one day and something else the next, I think is extremely challenging. And it's why you're seeing business confidence having declined so much and CEOs tearing their hair out, not knowing how to make decisions to best guide their businesses, not over a couple weeks timeline, but over years, decades, and trying to amortize the costs of those investments over a very long period of time.
The uncertainty in the market has been felt so much, Max, already as Americans and countries were given a few weeks before this April 2nd Liberation Day, as Trump would call it. So yes, it has been seen in the market already. But while we don't know the ins and the outs of what Donald Trump plans to announce today, which will be around 9 or 10 p.m. London time, but the Trump administration calls these countries the Dirty 15. He's referring to the 15% of countries that account for the bulk of US trading. Some of these will receive large tariffs, some will receive small ones. It completely depends on the amount of trading that they do and the amount of deficit there is between the countries. Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that these economies that have the largest trade deficits in goods with the US will feel the brunt. Now, to read out these countries, it's Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, the EU, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Switzerland, Taiwan, Thailand, Turkey, the UK, and Vietnam. So there's so many questions over which country will feel the brunt, and some reports indicate that India, which is the US's largest trading partner, will probably feel the biggest brunt just because, or one of the largest trading partners, I should say, because there's an imbalance between the countries of about $46 billion in favor of India. So is that your interpretation, that India will be the hardest hit in terms of how much of a percentage they'll be hit with a tariff, or are there other countries that will feel more out of those 15?
I think it's hard to speculate, as the White House announced this morning that it is putting the final touches on tariff policy. So if the administration isn't yet quite certain what it is rolling out, I wouldn't be one to guess. But I think the list you read out and the scope of the contemplated tariffs underscores just the breadth and speed of the administration's tariff actions this time around compared to the first Trump term. In the first administration, over the 4 years, tariffs were implemented on about $380 billion worth of goods. By the end of the day, we could see measures that cover 5 to up toward 10 times that amount. And here we are just a few months into the administration. So it really has been a stunning escalation. In terms of the particular countries and which one will be hardest hit, I mean, some of them are the closest of trading partners and even treaty allies as well, because there is more at stake here than just economics in some of these relationships. I think an interesting question to look out for is whether and to what extent there will be carve-outs, whether for countries, for sectors, for individual producers, that may offer some ability to tone down the costs both abroad and then domestically. Previously, the Trump administration has shown some facility in minimizing costs that could be politically damaging. So, for instance, during the first term, the administration ended up subsidizing U.S. farmers to the tune of, by one study, over 90% of the total tariff revenue collected from China, as a way of softening the blow of retaliatory tariffs. Now, I don't think that's necessarily good long-term policy when you consider that, those farmers who suffered when China pulled back sales, much of that market hasn't come back. So in soybeans, for instance, China has shifted its orders to Brazil largely, and the U.S. market still hasn't fully recovered. But whether and to what extent the Trump administration decides to subsidize domestic industries or provide carve-outs internationally could provide a bit of color around, in addition to what countries are hit hardest, and I think give us some indication about the path forward.
One of the I mentioned before, but there's this emphasis on trading deficit. So how much the United States is spending on other countries versus how much they're spending on them. And basically, the US wants to feel like they're getting their bang for their buck, pretty much. Now, one of the things that was interesting is that Australia, for instance, is in a federal deficit. They're in a federal surplus, which means that they they spend more on the US than the US spends on Australia, but it's still listed in these dirty 15 countries. So it is kind of interesting that the Australian government tried to broker an exemption from the steel and aluminium tariff because they were in this surplus. They didn't owe the United States anything, but the Trump administration have said no. And then on the other hand, Max, you have Keir Starmer saying that he's working towards trying to broker an economic deal with Trump. He said that there's rapid progress on that. But when you see Australia falling short in their attempts to broker this exemption from steel and aluminium, despite the fact that they're in a tariff surplus, and then you've got the UK trying to broker some sort of economic deal, it doesn't look as if Trump is really kind of, swaying towards helping out these long-standing allies.
Yeah, I think the willingness to impose tariffs on Australia, again, in a trade surplus, or the United Kingdom, who, by a quirk of accounting, each country shows the other or shows themselves as having a surplus with the other. I think it speaks to the breadth of the tariffs, the indiscriminate nature, and also, to some extent, the desire to elevate optics over the nuanced mechanics of policy. Trump has made no secret of his desire to go big on tariffs. It was one of his main lines throughout the campaign. It was a feature of his speech to Congress a few weeks ago, and he's following through on that. Nobody should be surprised, but I think there's a real desire in the White House to go big and to do what they see as following through on that, regardless of some of the nuances. Now, I do think Australia's trade surplus with the United States could give it a slightly better position when it comes to trying to negotiate down the road, because we don't anticipate many of these tariffs to stay where they're announced for long, or certainly for the entire term. So, maybe when it comes to a more pragmatic discussion about where things land, Australia will have an advantage. In terms of the UK, it is a long-standing, deep, symbiotic economic relationship with great cooperation in strategic sectors. And I think that cooperation will continue regardless of tariffs. And the Prime Minister's done, I think, faced a real challenge of navigating among China, the EU, and the US, and has navigated his relationship with Trump with nuance and in a way that I think has avoided much targeted downside to date. But if the UK is on the receiving end of tariffs this evening, I think he'll find that nobody is immune, and the only thing to do is to try to find a pragmatic way forward that will help protect British equities from his perspective. And even if he can escape the kind of broader tariffs, the sectoral ones on steel and aluminum, on autos, will still bite British producers and pose a real challenge.
It does seem right now that no one is safe. But Max, does Trump have a point when it comes to it's time for countries to pay their fair share? It's time for countries to not take advantage of the United States when it comes to these economic partnerships?
Look, I think there's a kernel of truth and certainly a political desire that the administration is very effectively tapped into. But I think ultimately it is a simplistic misdiagnosis of the economic reality. And worse than the diagnosis, I think, is the prescription. So the rules-based trading order that the United States has helped to develop and support has caused massive prosperity in the United States and around the world over the years. Now, it's true that some countries do have more trade barriers. Many have lower tariffs, but some do have barriers where they protect domestic industries or have unfair trade practices. The United States has traditionally been more open, though there are some industries where we impose higher tariffs than our partners do. Thinking about dairy in New Zealand, or automobiles in Japan, or certain types of trucks in Europe. But broadly, the U.S. has been quite open and benefited immensely from that openness in terms of global supply chains, cheap consumer imports, prosperity. I think one of the main mistakes that we've seen rehashed in the 2016 and 2020, now 2024 elections, is that the benefits of that openness, the benefits of global trade, were not broadly shared. There was a failure of investment. There was a failure of building adequate infrastructure, of dealing with workforce issues, of ensuring that the benefits that were felt in some places were spread throughout the country. And I think we're now seeing the comeuppance from that. But I think sins of the past don't necessarily mean that now is the time to double down on a coercive unilateral trade approach that threatens to make the U.S. economically worse off and threatens real damage to the global economy. I think there could be a more productive path forward, but we'll learn a lot today about just how ambitious and potentially how damaging the administration's trade plans are.
We absolutely will, but just a final question for you, Max. In terms of allies and closest relationships, and I don't want to sound too kind of blasé about the way I word this, but which country do you think will be kind of the most offended in the way that Donald Trump has slapped these tariffs on them? Because we've seen this war of words between the United States and Canada, which are probably the closest of allies, they're actual neighbours. So is there a particular country, including Canada, that are the most hurt by the way that Donald Trump has kind of not turned his back, but disrespected the loyalty and the allyship?
As a pragmatic kind of analytical policy matter, I think any target of a tariff will be offended in an economic sense, and that it is a threat to their economy, and that is something that policymakers, that leaders take very seriously, even taking any emotion out of it. I think you're right to highlight Canada. I think for a couple of reasons. First of all, by imposing tariffs on Canada, the administration is threatening to upend regional integration that has underwritten so much prosperity in the U.S. and Canada and Mexico as well, including through a trade agreement that was negotiated during the first Trump administration. I think using fentanyl smuggling as the predicate for those tariffs, a national emergency around fentanyl, as it relates to Canada, where fentanyl flows at the border are quite low, is quite offensive and an illusory justification. To add that to that, also this kind of bullying, violative of sovereignty, talk about Canada becoming the 51st state, kind of belittling rhetoric. I think that has a real cost. And you're seeing it in Canadian domestic politics, where the Liberal Party has been resurgent under a new prime minister as it goes into its election, after looking like it was going to face quite a defeat at the polls this year. You see it in U.S. domestic politics, where a Senate resolution to remove tariffs on Canada, to reverse those new tariffs, is attracting some Republican support. Now, it won't be enough to go to the White House and overcome a veto, but I think it's an interesting political signal. And you certainly see it from an international perspective in relations between the countries, where Canada is exploring alternatives to procuring the U.S. F-35 stealth fighter. One of its closest security allies, the fact that Canada worries that the U.S. will be unreliable, not only as an economic matter, but more broadly, I think is quite worrying, and reflects a broader trend that allies and others, partners around the world, are starting to explore alternatives to the U.S. The U.S. only accounts for about 13% of global imports, and for many countries, China is already their top trading partner. So I think we have to be a bit more cautious about these inflammatory and sweeping trade actions, because for a lot of countries, the choice between the U.S. and China may not be that hard. And for the ones for whom it is hard, we want to do everything we can to keep them on side and to jointly address Chinese overcapacity issues, unfair trade practices, and then also economic security and security questions, rather than push them away. And I think seeing South Korea and Japan meeting with China on economic matters quite recently is, I hesitate to overread any one signal or overstate the economic costs of it, but that is a worrying sign that the U.S. is pushing allies away when we really should be embracing them and talking about what we can do together.
There is that concern that them pushing these allies away will, in turn, push them into the arms of China, and that is a worrying situation to have there. So, Max, Yoeli, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me on. Pleasure speaking with you.